Greetings. Today our task is to distinguish between states and compare them based upon state capacity. What is this, you ask? Well, to answer that, let's return to your friend and mine, Max Weber. Now, Max Weber is that German sociologist that hopefully you remember from his discussion of sovereignty and legitimacy of the state. And he is one of the most important social scientists, and he came up with a lot of really useful concepts. And one such concept is the ideal type. And the modern state is really an ideal type. An ideal type is the purest version of something, in the abstract. It's like a Platonic form. The ideal type of the state would have all of the attributes of a state that we've discussed in previous lectures. It would be perfectly sovereign, both internally and externally, unquestionably legitimate, with flawless borders and a completely subservient and supportive populace. We never actually observe an ideal type in the real world. It's too theoretically perfect to actually exist. There is no state that perfectly matches what our ideal type of a state will be. But coming up with the ideal type of a state is useful because it allows us to help identify what is and is not a state. It also is very useful in helping us to compare states to one another in terms of which is closer to the ideal type of a state. We will use ideal types again when we try and compare other tricky abstract qualities, like how democratic, representative, or equal states are. For now, it's just important to note that state capacity for us is going to be the extent to which states can do all of the various aspects that we ask them to. The degree to which a state in the real world approximates our ideal type of a state is its state capacity. Now, how do we measure this? Well, that's tricky. Essentially, what we need are objective indicators to tell us the degree to which a state is legitimate, externally sovereign, internally sovereign, and so on and so forth. Lots of academics and nonprofits have worked to do this. Naturally, like anything a bunch of academics debate, the debate has gotten really detailed, really quite complex. For our purposes, we're going to just take a look at one really popular ranking, and that's from the Fund for Peace. And as you can see, they break it down into social, economic, and political indicators. And the idea is to measure states, giving them some quantity, some number on each of these various indicators, and then adding them all up to come up with a ranking that allows us to compare states on state capacity and on these various dimensions. So you can see that the social part includes things like demographic pressures. So are there large minorities growing within the state that are not representative? Massive refugee or displaced populations, a vengeance-seeking group, so a group that's fighting against the state. Economically, you can see huge inequality destabilizes it. Huge poverty or economic collapse. Politically, you see here our old friend, legitimacy of the state. Deterioration of public services, again, a state's ability to provide. Violation of human rights. A predatory security apparatus. You might think about police brutality or a police state. And then factionalized elites, so basically splits among the elites. So these are the ways that the Fund for Peace and scholars working there try to add up things to get this overall ranking. And of course, it's really tricky to do so, but they do end up in the end with a ranking. And here you can see their map for 2011. You can see the dark green and light green. Those are the few states that are quite close to the ideal type of a state as calculated by the Fund for Peace. And then there's a lot more yellow states, and those are also very strong, sustainable states. I guess not quite as ideal as Scandinavia. And then you can see orange getting less sustainable down to red and dark red. Those are the weakest and even failed states. So here you can see the most sustainable states in 2011. You might notice that Scandinavia, those countries in Northern Europe, seem to have the market cornered. Here are the least sustainable, and these are really failed states in 2011. And you can see these are actually mostly in Africa. Okay, so why does this matter? What does state capacity mean, and why should we care? Well, state capacity has a big effect for people living in those states. States that are closer to the ideal type of a state, those who would rank high on state capacity, are able to provide a lot of things to their citizens. These states have clearly marked territories and enforce their borders, and they have external and internal sovereignty and are perceived to be legitimate. They have effective bureaucracies in which public servants do their jobs and help the public, not taking bribes or playing favors. Because of all of this, they can provide public goods. People feel safe on the streets, they know that injustices will be taken care of, that their kids will get good educations, that the streets are clean and the water is clean, and countless other little things that many of us who live in strong states really take for granted every day. Life in failed states is different. You can think of life in failed states as being much closer to Hobbes' state of nature than life in the ideal type of a state. And remember, Hobbes' state of nature meant that life is nasty, brutish, and short. And unfortunately, in failed states, the state is unable to provide even the most basic services. It effectively loses its internal sovereignty. People in failed states may not have anybody to turn to for justice or protection. Indeed, in a lot of states, unfortunately, the security apparatus, the police and army, are exactly who you want protection from. Failed states can't really provide basic infrastructure, and in this way, people in failed states and failed states themselves get caught in a vicious circle, because you really need to provide these public goods and this basic infrastructure to get legitimacy. And without legitimacy, you can't tax, and without taxes, you can't provide them. So it's kind of a cyclical problem. And in failed states, other people might take up arms to protect themselves. So when the state can't provide security and public goods, you might get situations like organized crime, drug cartels, pirates in Somalia, shown here, that end up taking up arms to protect themselves and then kind of having a racket to protect others in exchange for some sort of exploitation. Of course, most states are somewhere in between the dark green of Scandinavia and the dark red of Somalia. Let's look at Mexico as a good example. So most states are sustainable, but they have significant challenges. And Mexico is a really great example of this. Mexican citizens enjoy a middle-level standard of living, and most have access to education and basic services. There are, however, significant challenges, particularly involving the drug cartels. The government security forces have clashed violently with the cartels that make their money getting drugs to Americans. That represents a major challenge to the Mexican state's internal sovereignty, and the inability of the Mexican and American security apparatuses to stop the cartels has had really tragic effects on the lives of many Mexican citizens. Another major challenge to Mexico and most countries is corruption, which eats away at the rational bureaucratic functioning of the state's organization. Corruption means some are getting unfair access to power and resources because they pay officials off or are well connected. That's unfair in principle, but it's also practically bad, as it means that the state runs much less efficiently. Finally, again, like almost all states, the Mexican state faces occasional questioning of its legitimate authority. Here are protests in June of 2012, right before the presidential election, questioning the likely return to power of the PRI, a party that ruled Mexico as an authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regime for most of the 20th century. So that's a basic overview of some of the outputs of state capacity. Now, let's try and think about what explains state capacity. Well, like so often, this brings up the big questions of reverse causation, as the things that explain state capacity are also explained by state capacity. Here's a for instance. If state capacity boils down to a state's ability to provide for its citizens, then really its ability to extract taxes and turn around and use that income to provide should be the key causal variable. But for a state to tax, it has to be efficient in operation and legitimate in the eyes of its citizens. This is actually part of state capacity. It's very conceptually tricky stuff. As we mentioned earlier, states with weak state capacity can seem to be caught in a vicious cycle, in which their weak state capacity leads to more corruption, less legitimacy and sovereignty, which in turn equals less state capacity. The same can be true, on the other hand, for states with high state capacity. They can be seen as being in a virtuous circle, in which their high state capacity means they are more legitimate and sovereign, and therefore they get more tax money, etc., to provide for people, and their state capacity increases. Indeed, one of the ways state capacity is often measured is the state's ability to extract. That is, can the state tax people? Putting a tax law on the books and having people actually comply to the tax law and willfully send you their hard-earned money, those are two really different things, and state capacity is a big key in explaining when people actually pay. Only a state with an efficient, rational legal bureaucracy and high legitimacy will get people to willingly comply and send in their money. But how do states get to the point that they can extract? How do they get that legitimacy? One explanation is that it is all about the creation of impersonal institutions, so weeding out corruption and creating that rational legal bureaucracy that works based on rules and non-partial norms instead of actually favoring some over others. When you feel like there's blatant favoritism, nepotism, and corruption going on, you're not going to send your money in. So what impersonal institutions mean is that elites are also constrained by laws, not just people. This would mean, for instance, that the security services don't belong to a specific leader. They don't belong to one person, but they belong to the state. They serve the state, and they only serve a leader insofar as that leader also serves the state. So when that leader's term is up, or when that leader gets accused of doing something illegal, then it becomes the security apparatus's duty to prosecute, or at least stop following that leader. Another way to think of this is from the perspective of just a normal person trying to get their business with the state done. So imagine that you're going to the BMV because you want to get your driver's license renewed. Well, if the state's institutions are impersonal, that means that what matters for actually getting it renewed is that you show up when the office is open, that you have the correct forms filled out, the correct fees, you don't have any sort of outstanding warrant on your head or something ridiculous like that. Well, if the state's institutions are personalized, if there's some form of corruption, then all of that might not matter. What might matter is whether you pay a big enough bribe, whether you know the right person. Are you related to somebody? Do you have a good friend in the office? It might matter whether you are in the right ethnic or religious group. If you're in that group, you're great. You'll get it without filling out the correct forms even. If you're not, however, you might not get your new driver's license no matter what you do. So you can see from the perspective of a citizen, if there is this sort of rampant corruption, you're going to be much less willing to pay for state services that you're not really getting anyway. You don't see the state as legitimate. Well, it's easy to fall into that vicious cycle, however, because when the state doesn't have people paying for the services, they're not able to provide the services. And think of it from the perspective of that bureaucrat. If the state's not able to pay for services, the bureaucrat's wages are next to nothing. So to support his or her family, it might make sense to try and take out bribes, which further exacerbates the problem. So you can see how it's pretty easy for states to fall into this vicious cycle of low state capacity. One popular explanation, and one really good independent variable for why there might be low state capacity in some places, is a colonial legacy. Indeed, most weak and failed states are former colonies. So why would this be? Well, the colonial heritage did not help with the creation of impersonal institutions, as the population from the colonial homeland were often favored, and the colonists from that homeland often favored certain native groups within the colony over others. Therefore, it's kind of setting up a system in which it's easy for personalized institutions to develop. Colonialism also involved foisting foreign institutions upon a state. Instead of having the members of that state's political community negotiating over their own institutions, if they were able to negotiate over their own institutions, that really helps perceptions of legitimacy from elites, which, when the elites play by the rules, that helps legitimacy in the eyes of the people. So you can see if the elites don't see the institutions as legitimate because they were just kind of imposed upon them, that means that there's a route for less legitimacy in the eyes of everybody. Finally, the borders drawn by colonial powers as they exited often were quite arbitrary, and that increased the potential for conflict, because that meant that national and state boundaries often did not align. This creates potential for conflict when nations of people have no state, or nations are spread out among multiple states, or different nations are grouped together in the same state, and when they might have a history of conflict with one another. So you can see how when, as we talked about earlier, when state boundaries and national boundaries conflict, there is often a lot of potential for fighting amongst the different groups over political power, over where to draw boundaries, over who gets to be in charge. A related and quite surprising independent variable is natural resource wealth. This is known as the resource curse. It's the surprising finding that a state rich in natural resources like oil or diamonds is often weaker and less democratic. Why should this be? So here it's more money means that states are less democratic. Well, if extraction is one of the best ways for states to develop capacity, why should this be? Basically because this is not extraction, this is kind of skimming off the top. Elites with an easy revenue source like oil or diamonds don't have to negotiate. They don't have to negotiate with other elites, and they don't have to negotiate with the people to take from them. They just kind of pay off competitors and citizens. This allows them to pay off in the short term without really developing the long-term political stability and political capacity that equates to state capacity. They avoid actual performance or in the negotiation over politics and political institutions. This means the rule is never depersonalized and the state institutions remain hollow. So you can see again, it's just like with colonialism, the resource curse involves the causal mechanism of developing impersonal or personal political institutions. The international system also kind of works this way. For instance, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union both bought off leaders of various weak states, providing them with a stream of revenues they had exclusive control over, so just like oil or diamond revenue. They provided this revenue in exchange for their geopolitical support in the Cold War. Another less malignant international independent variable that helps explain the dependent variable of state capacity is the current international system that encourages quasi-states. Whereas when the state developed in Europe, a weak state wouldn't last long because its neighbors would conquer it, today the international order and the United Nations support states' sovereignty and generally punish such invasions. Thus, some very weak and failed states have international recognition and legal sovereignty, despite the fact that they may have no internal sovereignty. So essentially, the international system that recognizes state sovereignty has actually created a system in which the sort of natural selection mechanism that worked in Europe to create strong states doesn't exist anymore. That's why we have quasi-states. Essentially, they have legal recognition, but they don't have internal sovereignty. They don't have internally any of the institutions or capabilities that our ideal type of a state has. So those are some independent variables that explain the dependent variable of state capacity. Well, let's think of state capacity as an independent variable that explains other dependent variables before we conclude. This is tricky. State capacity helps explain a number of political phenomena, but because of the issue of reverse causation, a lot of the things it helps explain also explain it. I know, it's confusing, and it's a common problem in the social sciences. So state capacity has numerous effects, the kinds of things we looked at in the beginning of the lecture with the ability to provide security, schools, and other basic services. State capacity is an important predictor of how much states are able to provide human rights for their citizens as well. One thing that state capacity does seem to help is economic prosperity. Businesses need stability to grow and thrive. They need well-educated workers. They need the enforcement of laws, particularly those laws pertaining to contracts and property. So they basically need to say, if I buy something or if I sign a contract, there's a justice system that makes sure that I get that in the end. They need a great deal of infrastructure. Of course, this is not a clear one-way causal relationship, as economic prosperity is a huge contributor to state capacity as well. So, as you can see, state capacity is a really important variable to try and explain, but as so many variables that we'll try and explain in comparative politics and in social science more broadly, it gets tricky to explain because of multiple causal pathways that work both ways. So this has been a very brief overview of a very complicated set of issues. They are important for us to think about because state capacity is a variable that has enormous effects on the lives of all citizens in the world. Thank you, and good luck with the rest of the lectures.